She sat at the farthest end of the long dining table, a place so distant from the Duke that the candlelight barely reached her face. The crystal chandelier threw diamonds of light across the silverware and white linen, but all of it stopped well before her plate. She was a shadow at her own husband's table. He did not look at her, he never did. The Duke of Ashwick, Lucian Vane, sat at the head of the table with the effortless authority of a man who had never needed anyone. His dark hair was perfectly in place. His jaw was carved stone. When he spoke, it was to his steward about estate matters, his voice low and cold, every word measured. Lady Alara Vane, his wife of 6 months, cut her roasted pheasant into tiny pieces she did not eat. She had learned not to expect his attention, but tonight the humiliation was not just his silence. It was the guests. His cousin, Lady Miranda Vane, occupied the seat at his right hand, where a wife should have sat. Miranda's golden hair shimmered as she laughed at something he said, her gloved fingers brushing his sleeve. The other guests, local gentry and a visiting viscount, followed Miranda's lead as if she were already the mistress of Ashwick Hall. "I do hope the new rose garden will be finished before the autumn ball," Miranda said, her voice sweet as poisoned honey. "It has always been my dream to host a dance beneath the roses at Ashwick." Alara's fingers tightened around her fork. The rose garden had been her idea. She had sketched the plans herself, quietly hopping to bring some life to the neglected eastern terrace. She had mentioned it to the housekeeper. The housekeeper must have mentioned it to Miranda. The Duke nodded. "See that it is done." He did not glance at Alara. He did not say, "My wife thought of it first." He simply granted Miranda's wish as if Alara did not exist. A woman to Alara's left, a baroness with eager eyes, leaned close enough to whisper, "They say he only married her to honor a debt to her late father, a charity arrangement, really. She's nothing to him." The words slipped under Alara's skin like needles. She set down her fork. Her hands, she noticed, were trembling, so she folded them in her lap. She had not cried since the day she stood at the altar and saw the emptiness in her husband's gray eyes. She would not cry now. The dinner ended. The Duke rose without offering his arm to his wife. The guests filtered into the drawing room. Alara walked alone, the train of her pale blue gown whispering against the marble floor. That night she lay in her cold bedchamber, staring at the canopy above. She had entered this marriage hopping for kindness, perhaps friendship, maybe someday love. She had been so foolish. Love was a word this house did not speak. She made a decision in the dark, a quiet one that nobody heard. She would stop hopping. She would stop seeking his gaze. She would stop wondering what she had done wrong. If she was to be invisible, then she would become invisible on her own terms. She would find a life beyond his notice. That was the first night Lady Alara Vane began to let go. The following morning, Alara rose before the sun. She dressed without the help of a maid, choosing a simple gray gown that required no fuss. She did not go to the breakfast room where the Duke would be. Instead, she walked out the side door into the misty gardens. Ashwick Hall was a grand estate of pale stone and towering windows, surrounded by wild parkland that had not been properly tended in years. The previous Duchess, Lucian's mother, had died when he was a boy, and the gardens had been left to run rampant. Alara had noticed a walled corner beyond the kitchen gardens, hidden by an overgrown yew hedge. She pushed through the damp branches and found it, a forgotten garden, choked with brambles and weeds. But beneath the neglect she saw the bones of something beautiful, an old stone fountain, dry and cracked, rose canes tangled with ivy, a sundial tilted on its pedestal. It was a place that had once been loved and then abandoned. Much like herself, Alara rolled up her sleeves. She found a rusted trowel in the gardener's shed and began to work. Days passed. Her hands blistered and then calloused. The kitchen staff whispered about the Duchess who dug in the dirt like a common laborer. Lady Miranda, on a visit to the hall, saw Alara with soil on her cheek and laughed behind her fan. "My dear, you look positively rustic. Do you not have a gardener for such tasks?" Ilara simply smiled, a polite, distant smile she was perfecting. "I find it calming." Miranda's eyes narrowed, sensing a change she could not name. "I am sure Lucien would not approve of his wife grubbing in the mud." "Then it is fortunate he pays me so little attention," Ilara replied, and returned to her work. Miranda's cheeks flushed with irritation, but she had no retort. It was the first small victory Ilara had ever claimed in that house. The forgotten garden began to bloom. Ilara cleared the weeds, pruned the roses, and coaxed the fountain back to life with the help of a patient groundskeeper. She planted lavender and rosemary, foxgloves and sweet peas. The walled space became a sanctuary, a pocket of color and scent hidden from the main house. Nobody came there except her. She also began walking to the village. At first, the tenants and tradespeople stared at the new duchess with open curiosity. They had heard rumors of the cold marriage, but Ilara did not act like a great lady. She stopped to speak with the baker's wife, whose son had a persistent cough. She visited the cottage of an elderly widow whose roof leaked. She wrote letters to the steward requesting repairs, and when the steward delayed, she arranged for the work herself using her own small allowance. She did not do it to be noticed. She did it because she needed to be useful to someone, because kindness, she discovered, was a balm that soothed her own bruised heart. The Duke noticed nothing. His days were filled with political correspondence, rides across the estate, and long silences in his library. He saw his wife at dinner occasionally, seated at the far end of the table, her hair simply dressed, her gowns modest. She no longer wore the bright silk she had worn as a new bride, hopping to catch his eye. She dressed like a woman who no longer expected to be seen. He should have felt relieved. Her quietness was convenient. Her lack of demands allowed him to maintain the emotional fortress he had built over a lifetime. But something began to nag at him, a faint irritation he could not identify. The first crack appeared on an unremarkable Tuesday. The Duke was riding back from the North Fields when he passed the village green. He saw a cluster of children laughing, and in the center of them, a woman in a plain gray dress was kneeling in the grass, showing a little girl how to weave a crown of daisies. Her dark hair had slipped from its pins, and there was a smudge of dirt on her cheek. She was laughing. He pulled his horse to a stop. It was Ilara, his wife, laughing. He had never seen her laugh. In 6 months, he had not once heard the sound. It was soft and warm, completely unguarded, and it struck him in a place he did not want to acknowledge. Then a man stepped out of the village schoolhouse. He was tall, with kind eyes and sandy hair, wearing the simple coat of a scholar. He smiled at Ilara and said something that made her laugh again. She stood, brushing grass from her skirt, and together they walked toward the cottage that served as the village library. The Duke's hands tightened on the reins. He recognized the man, Mr. William Hastings, a younger son of a baronet, recently arrived to catalog the Ashwick estate's historical records. He was intelligent, respectable, and entirely too close to the Duchess. Lucien told himself the uncomfortable heat in his chest was mere propriety. A duchess should not be so familiar with an unmarried gentleman. It was a matter of reputation, nothing more. He rode away without approaching them, but that night at dinner he looked at her. It was a small thing, a glance that lasted only a moment. Ilara was buttering a piece of bread, her attention on her plate. She did not meet his eyes because she had long stopped trying. When the meal ended, she excused herself quietly and disappeared into the corridors. He sat alone in the dining room, the candles burning low, and felt the weight of his empty house. The summer deepened. Lady Miranda continued her campaign of quiet cruelty, ensuring that Ilara was excluded from any gathering of importance. When the Ashwick Autumn Ball invitations were sent, Miranda's name was listed as hostess alongside the Duke. Ilara's name was absent. The Tun noticed. Whispers spread through drawing rooms across the county. The Duke of Ashwick's wife is so insignificant she does not even host his own ball. Lady Miranda is the true mistress of the hall. Elara heard the rumors during a visit to the modiste. The seamstress's assistant, a young girl with a loose tongue, spoke before she realized who was standing behind her. Poor creature, they say he cannot bear to look at her, married her out of pity and now regrets it every day. Elara turned and walked out without a word. She did not weep. She had trained herself not to, but something inside her hardened into diamond. She returned to Ashwick Hall and went directly to the Forgotten Garden. She worked until her arms ached and the moon rose, tearing out every last weed, planting a border of white roses that would bloom next spring. She would not be at the ball. She would not fight for a place at his side. Let Miranda have her triumph. Let the world whisper. Elara had a garden now, and the children of the village, and the quiet respect of the tenants who had learned that the silent Duchess was the one who actually cared. The day of the autumn ball arrived. The great hall glittered with candlelight and flowers. Carriages lined the drive. Music spilled from the open doors. Lady Miranda drifted through the crowd in a gown of gold silk, her hand resting possessively on the Duke's arm. Elara was not present. She had sent her regrets, a polite note citing a headache. The Duke had read it with an unreadable expression and then crumpled it in his fist. He spent the first hour of the ball scanning the crowd without realizing he was doing it. He looked for a head of dark hair, a quiet smile, a gray gown, but she was not there. Her absence was a hollow note in the music, a cold draft in a warm room. Mr. Hastings was also absent. A servant mentioned that the scholar had taken a basket of books to the village schoolhouse that evening. The Duchess, the servant added thoughtlessly, had been seen walking that way earlier. The Duke felt something splinter inside him. He excused himself from Miranda's clinging hand and strode out into the night. The village schoolhouse was a modest stone building with a lamp burning in the window. Through the glass, Lucian saw them. Elara sat on a low stool, a book open in her lap, reading aloud to a small group of children gathered at her feet. Mr. Hastings stood nearby, leaning against the doorframe, watching her with an expression of unmistakable admiration. It was not an improper scene. It was innocent, warm, full of the gentle goodness that Elara radiated, and that made it infinitely worse. Because Lucian understood in that sharp moment that his wife had built an entire life without him. She had found purpose and peace and perhaps even happiness, and none of it had anything to do with him. He was not the center of her world. He was barely a shadow on its edge. He had never felt so utterly unnecessary. He walked back to the hall alone. The music seemed garish. The laughter grated. He stood at the edge of his own ballroom, a duke in full command of his domain, and felt like a trespasser in his own life. The following week, a fever swept through the village. It came swiftly, striking children and the elderly first. The local physician was overwhelmed. Elara did not hesitate. She packed a basket of remedies, clean linens, and broth, and she went to the cottages herself. She had no medical training, but she had steady hands and a calm presence. She sponged fevered foreheads, held the hands of frightened mothers, and sat through long nights in cramped, smoky rooms. She did not sleep. She did not eat properly. She gave everything she had. Mr. Hastings assisted where he could, fetching water and medicine. The villagers began to call her the Good Duchess, a title spoken with reverence. Lucian heard the reports from his steward. At first, he felt a cold flicker of disapproval. It was dangerous for her to expose herself to illness, but he did not summon her. He did not command her to stop. He had no right to command anything from her anymore. Then the steward mentioned that the Duchess had not returned to the hall in 3 days. She was sleeping in a chair at the widow's cottage, tending a child who could not survive the night without constant care. Something inside Lucian cracked wide open. He rode to the village at dawn. The streets were empty. the air thick with the smell of wood smoke and sickness. He found the widow's cottage and pushed open the door. Ilara sat in a wooden chair beside a narrow bed. A small boy lay there, his breathing shallow but steady. Ilara's head had fallen forward. She was asleep, her face pale with exhaustion, dark circles bruising the skin beneath her eyes. Her hands, still resting on the boy's blanket, were raw and red from washing. Lucian stood in the doorway, the great Duke of Ashwick, and felt his throat close. He had seen soldiers fall in battle without flinching. He had buried his parents and sealed his heart. But the sight of his wife, worn thin from giving love to strangers because he had given her none, undid him completely. He crossed the room. He lifted her gently, cradling her against his chest. She stirred, murmuring something, but did not wake. She weighed almost nothing. He carried her out of the cottage and into his carriage, holding her all the way back to Ashwick Hall. He laid her in her bedchamber and summoned the physician. He stood by the window and watched the doctor examine her, his jaw tight, his hands clenched behind his back. "Exhaustion, Your Grace," the physician said, "and she may have caught a touch of the fever herself. She must rest." "She will have everything she needs," Lucian said. His voice was hoarse, as if he had not spoken in years. He stayed. He did not leave her room. He sat in the chair beside her bed and watched the shallow rise and fall of her chest. He remembered with a pain that felt like a blade the first time he had seen her. She had arrived at Ashwick Hall a bride, her eyes bright with nervous hope, a bouquet of wildflowers in her hands because she had not wanted anything too grand. He had looked at her with cold courtesy and thought, this is an arrangement, nothing more. He had been a fool, a blind, arrogant, cowardly fool. The truth he had buried for months rose up and demanded to be faced. He had been cold because he was afraid. He had pushed her away because his mother's miserable marriage had taught him that love was a weapon, and he had sworn never to be weak enough to feel it. But Ilara had never been a threat. She had been a gift, and he had thrown her aside. He leaned forward and pressed his forehead to her cool hand. "Come back to me," he whispered, a broken prayer. "Please, come back and I will spend every day of my life making this right." Ilara's fever broke on the fourth day. She woke to pale sunlight and the unfamiliar weight of a blanket tucked around her shoulders. The room was her own, but it felt different, warmer. There were fresh flowers on the mantelpiece, lavender and rosemary from her garden. She turned her head. The Duke sat in a chair by the window, his dark hair disheveled, his cravat loosened, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that stole her breath. "You are awake," he said. His voice was rough, full of something she could not name. She tried to sit up. "The boy, the widow's son. He is recovering. The fever has passed the worst. You saved him." Ilara closed her eyes, relief washing through her. Then she opened them again and looked at her husband. "Why are you here?" It was not an accusation. It was a genuine question, spoken by a woman who had stopped expecting anything. Lucian rose and crossed to her bedside. He knelt, an act so startling that Ilara flinched. Dukes did not kneel, not to anyone. "Because I have been a fool," he said, each word heavy with regret. "Because I let you suffer in silence while I built walls to protect a heart I was too afraid to open. Because you have been more of a duchess to this estate than I have ever been a duke to you." She stared at him, her lips parted. "I do not understand." He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded piece of paper, worn and creased as if it had been read many times. He placed it on the blanket beside her hand. "I found this in your writing desk. I was looking for you, for any piece of you I could hold onto while you were ill." Ilara looked down. The letter was in her own handwriting, addressed to him, dated a week before their wedding. "Your Grace, I must tell you the truth before we stand before God. I did not conspire to trap you into this marriage. I tried to warn you. My uncle intercepted my letters. He threatened to ruin my brother if I did not comply with his scheme to force our union. Please believe me, I would never have deceived you. I would rather be ruined than cause you a moment's dishonor. I am so sorry." It was the letter she had written and never sent. She had been too terrified of her uncle's threats. She had walked down the aisle carrying this secret, and she had let him believe she was complicit in the scandal that had forced their marriage. Her eyes filled with tears. "You were not supposed to see that." "I wish I had seen it the day you wrote it," he said, his voice breaking. "I wish I had known. All these months I thought you were part of the scheme. I thought you had played a role in manipulating me. I was so blinded by my own pride that I never asked. I never listened." A tear slid down her cheek. She had borne the weight of that false guilt for so long. "I tried to tell you, but you would not look at me." He flinched as if she had struck him. "I know, and I will never forgive myself. But I am begging you, Alara, give me a chance to earn your forgiveness. I do not deserve it, but I love you. I love you too late, and I am terrified it is too late." The words hung in the air, raw and real. She had dreamed of hearing them. She had given up that dream. Now it sat in front of her, dressed in a duke's kneeling form, and she did not know if she could trust it. "You ignored me," she whispered. "You let your cousin humiliate me. You made me feel like a ghost in my own home. I learned to live without you, Lucien. I built a life that does not need you." He did not look away. "I know, I saw you in the garden laughing with the children. I saw you with Hastings. I saw a woman who had found joy without me, and it broke something in my chest. But it also made me proud, because you are remarkable. You are the strongest person I have ever known. And I want to be worthy of standing beside you. Not in front of you, not ignoring you, beside you, if you will let me." She was silent for a long moment. The fire crackled. Outside, the autumn wind stirred the bare branches of the oak trees. Then she asked the question that mattered most. "Why were you so cold? It was not only the letter, there was something else." He bowed his head. "My mother married my father for love. He did not return it. She spent 20 years trying to win his affection, and he spent 20 years destroying her spirit. I watched her fade. I vowed I would never let myself be that vulnerable, so I shut out everything that could hurt me, including you." She understood then. He was not heartless. He was afraid. He had been a boy who watched love destroy his mother, and he had carried that terror into manhood. It did not excuse his cruelty, but it explained it. Slowly she reached out and touched his hand. His fingers closed around hers, desperate and gentle. "I am not your mother," she said softly, "and you are not your father. We can be something different, but only if you promise never to shut me out again. I cannot survive being invisible twice." "Never," he said. "I swear it. I will spend the rest of my life proving that you are seen, you are valued, and you are loved." She looked at him, this proud man kneeling at her bedside, his eyes red-rimmed with sleeplessness and fear. And she felt the first stirrings of hope she had allowed herself in months. It was fragile, tentative, but it was there. "Then stay," she said, "and talk to me. Tell me about your day, ask me about mine. Let us begin again slowly." He let out a breath that was almost a sob. He lifted her hand and pressed it to his lips. "Thank you, thank you." They did not rush. There were no grand declarations in ballrooms, no dramatic reconciliations before a crowd. Their healing happened in quiet moments, shared breakfasts where he finally sat beside her instead of at the distant head of the table, walks through her garden where he listened to her explain each plant, evenings by the fire where he told her about his mother and the pain he had never spoken aloud. Lady Miranda attempted one final act of malice. She arrived at Ashwick Hall uninvited, wearing a triumphant smile, and announced that she had secured the Duke's agreement to host a winter house party, with herself as hostess. Lucien met her in the entrance hall. Alara stood a few steps behind him, her hand resting lightly on the banister. "Cousin Miranda," Lucien said, his voice colder than the winter wind, "there has been a misunderstanding. My wife is the hostess of Ashwick Hall. She will arrange any gatherings that take place here. You are welcome as a guest, but you will treat her with the respect due to a duchess, or you will not be welcome at all." Miranda's face went white, then red. She looked at Alara with naked fury. "This is your doing. You have turned him against his own family." "No," Alara said, her voice steady. "I simply stopped letting you speak for me." Miranda swept out of the house and did not return. The whispers in society shifted, as whispers do. The ton began to speak of the Duke of Ashwick's devotion to his quiet, gracious wife. They wondered how they had ever believed the rumors of a cold marriage. In the spring, the white roses Alara had planted in the forgotten garden bloomed for the first time. She walked there with Lucien, their fingers intertwined, the scent of lavender filling the air. "I want to show you something," he said, leading her to the old sundial. He had commissioned an engraving on its base, new words carved into the ancient stone. For Alara, who found beauty in the abandoned and taught a cold heart to love. She traced the letters with her fingertips, her eyes shining. "When did you do this?" "While you were sleeping, during those long nights I sat by your bed. I needed to do something with my hands, or I would have gone mad with fear." She turned to him and saw the man he had become, still reserved in public, still powerful, but with eyes that softened whenever they found her face. He had not become a different person. He had become a fuller version of himself, one that made room for love. "I was so invisible," she said, remembering. "I thought I would disappear entirely and no one would notice." He cupped her face in his hands. "I would have noticed. I did notice. I was just too stubborn to admit it, but I will spend every day of my life making sure you know you are the center of my world. The sun rises and sets with you, Alara. It always did. I was just standing in my own shadow." She laughed, a free, joyful sound that echoed off the garden walls. "You are becoming quite poetic, Your Grace." "Only for you," he said. And he kissed her softly in the garden she had brought back to life, while the roses nodded their white heads in the breeze. The story of the Duke of Ashwick and his silent wife became a legend in the county, told by firesides and whispered at balls. It was a story of pain, of loneliness endured and hope abandoned, of a woman who learned to love herself when no one else would, and a man who realized too late that he had everything and almost lost it. But it was also a story of healing, of two people who chose every single day to be present for one another, to speak instead of assume, to see instead of ignore. And in the end, that was the truest romance. Not the grand gesture, not the passionate confession, but the quiet, steady work of rebuilding something that had been broken. The decision to stay, to try, to love. As the years passed, the forgotten garden grew into the most famous spot on the estate. Visitors came from far away to see the Duchess's roses, and if they looked closely, they might see the Duke and Duchess walking there at dusk, hand in hand, still talking, still listening, still choosing each other. The silent wife was silent no more, and the cold Duke had learned at last to speak the language of the heart.